quelques mots juste de présentation. Nous sommes là donc aujourd'hui pour discuter dans ce séminaire de la crise de la légitimité de l'Europe, et on a la chance de recevoir Vivien Schmidt, qui est prof de relations internationales à l'Université de Boston, titulaire d'une chaire Jean Monnet d'intégration européenne et qui a longtemps dirigé le centre d'études européennes de l'Université de Boston, qui maintenant doit s'appeler Global Studies, je pense. Et Vivien a écrit d'abord plusieurs livres sur la France, rappelons-le, parce que c'est quelqu'un qui connaît très bien la France, pour y avoir étudié à Sciences Po et aussi y avoir enseigné. Donc ça a démarré par un ouvrage sur l'histoire politique de la décentralisation en France qui s'appelait Democratizing France. Il y a eu un autre ouvrage sur le passage de la régulation de l'État au marché, From State to Market, en 96. Plusieurs autres ouvrages importants, mais je vais citer juste les trois derniers. L'ouvrage sur The Futures of European Capitalism, et celui qui a été traduit en français, Le Sol, que je montre ici, la démocratie en Europe, en 2010. Et puis évidemment celui qui va nous occuper aujourd'hui, Europe Crisis of Legitimacy, qui va être du coup discuté, puisque c'est le principe même du séminaire, à la fois par une chercheuse junior et une chercheuse confirmée. La chercheuse junior, vous la voyez sans doute à l'écran à côté de Vivien, c'est Morgane DELORME, et Morgane réalise une thèse de philosophie politique, en l'occurrence sur la philosophie de la Banque centrale européenne, en particulier de ses interventions depuis la période Draghi, disons, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, en co-tutelle avec l'Université de Nantes d'un côté et l'Université de Montréal de l'autre. Et puis ensuite, nous aurons ma collègue Muriel ROUYER, que vous voyez un peu plus loin, professeure de sciences politiques et qui est également membre associé du Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation à la Kennedy School de Harvard. Le principe, c'est que Vivien va avoir la parole à peu près 40 minutes. Ensuite, Morgane pourra poser ses questions et Vivien pendant à peu près 15 minutes, et Vivien pourra répondre. Ensuite, Muriel posera ses questions pendant à peu près 15 minutes et Vivien pourra répondre. Et ensuite, on ouvrira une séquence où vous pourrez poser vos propres questions vers la fin. Pendant les interventions, vous pouvez parfaitement commencer à poser des questions en utilisant le chat, la petite rubrique converser. Vivien, mille merci d'avoir accepté cette invitation. Je vous laisse la parole pour présenter votre intervention.
Merci beaucoup. Enchantée d'être ici, enchantée de vous faire votre connaissance par Zoom. Et en fait, je vais partager mon écran et puis je vais parler en anglais. Alors, voilà. Ça y est, je pense que vous le voyez. Alors, now I won't translate. So, this is a talk about my book, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. And it's, I will end with talking about COVID-19 and some of the lessons learned and whether we've gotten beyond this crisis of legitimacy or not. I've been writing some on COVID-19 lately as well. So just to get started. Okay, so Europe's crisis, Euro crisis of legitimacy. This is a crisis not just about economics or politics, it's about legitimacy. Governing by rules and ruling by numbers that began in 2010 as member states and EU institutions doubled down on the rules actually put legitimacy at risk, because they ended up ensuring that the EU the Eurozone had deteriorating economics and increasingly toxic politics. But that's not the end of the story, and I think that's important, because even though from the outside, the EU lost tremendous legitimacy, there was an assumption that nothing had changed, but by 2013 and between 2013 and 2015, what you saw is EU institutional actors began reinterpreting the rules and calculating the numbers, but they did it by stealth without admitting it. So what you ended up with was incremental improvement, but you still had the suboptimal rules and perceptions of illegitimacy. From 2015 on, so we have a change in commission. The Juncker Commission admits to the reinterpretations, but by then the damage had already been done in terms of legitimacy. It's only in 2020 with COVID-19 that we see a suspension of the rules, a breaking of the taboo of the EU shared debt. And the question then would be, is this a kind of redemption moment or not, which I'll end up talking about at the end. So you might ask, why talk about legitimacy in the Eurozone crisis? And for me, it became a very useful lens through which to investigate all aspects of the crisis: political economy, politics, and governance processes. The fact is that when I started this study, I was focused as much on political economy as everything else. But I realized that toward the end, so much had been written on the political economy, some on the governance process, other things on the politics, but there was nothing actually that pulled it all together. And I found that talking about legitimacy was a very useful way to actually pull all of these very important aspects of the crisis together. And in terms of, because I'm using legitimacy, I take EU actors as sentient agents. So it's not just about interest-focused actors with rationalist explanations of why they did it, creditor versus debtors, et cetera. But it's also not focused only on talking about path-dependent rules, because they double down on the rules were there, what else were they going to do? And it's also not just about cultural frames, ordoliberal visions, blinding people. No, what I wanted to do was look at the EU actors themselves and ask, and see them as thinking, speaking, and acting agents who also seek to legitimate their actions. As a result, the methodology I'm using, or the methodological approach, the analytic framework, is discursive institutionalism, an approach that I've developed over the years that tries to bring ideas and discourse back into political science, something very much necessary in the US, perhaps less so in France, where you've always had the référentiel school and others, where ideas have been taken and discourse has generally been taken much more seriously. But in any case, discursive institutionalism focuses on the substantive content of ideas and the interactive processes of discourse in institutional context. And because I take this approach, I find that because we're looking at ideas and discourse, it serves as a bridge to legitimacy, but also to power. Thinking about ideational power, as well as, of course, the traditional political science sources of power, coercive and institutional, not to mention structural sources as well. So that's essentially the basis of the approach. But then you might ask, and I had to do this myself quite a while, so what is legitimacy? And confession, in the first draft of the introduction, that was the one thing I didn't define. So how do we define, which is typical, of course. And actually, if you read lots of accounts of legitimacy in this or that, no one defines legitimacy. So here I'm going to give you a rather thin definition of legitimacy, but one that I think works in this context. So legitimacy, in the traditional way that people look at it, in the Weberian sense, as in Max Weber, is looking at legitimacy as the governing authority, public trust and public consent in a governing authority. But what I do here is I say we also need to look at legitimacy as governing activity, which of course can enhance or undermine governing authority. And that's about policy effectiveness, political responsiveness, and the procedural quality of governance, which I will go into deeper in a minute. The question would be, if we're talking about legitimacy and we're talking about it in Europe, is the EU democratically legitimate? So question one, as a governing authority, and I argue in the book that actually yes, because slowly but surely over time in policy area after policy area, what you found is increasing public consent in deeper and deeper integration of the EU. At least the member states did it, so it's at least tacitly public consent by the populations. But is the EU democratically legitimate as a democracy? Well, obviously that's a more complicated question because the EU is not in itself a democracy, but its member states are democracy and the EU is democratic. But in its various principles and the way in which it operates for the most part. But what about as a governing, in terms of governing activity? Is the EU democratically legitimate? And I would argue here too, in most policy areas, in many policy areas over the years, it has been legitimate in terms of its governing activity. But the Eurozone crisis over the past decade has really raised major questions about that legitimacy. That's where it's been most problematic. So before we go on to talk about the empirics of the crisis, I want to look at legitimacy in the EU as a governing activity closer and introduce some terms. So we need to think about legitimacy as political, performance, and procedural. I use the terms of EU studies, systems theory, and sorry guys, nothing I can do about that. Input output has been sort of deeply ingrained in the EU studies language, if you will. So what I tried is so I conform to that. We have to speak the same language, but I added another category. But first, output legitimacy is essentially a performance criteria. It's about policy effectiveness and performance, so good outcomes. Input legitimacy is a political criterion. It's about representation, citizen representation, participation, political responsiveness of governing elites. And generally these two, and this is sort of the traditional discussion, it's Fritz Scharpf and others, but basically there's an assumption that there are trade-offs. A policy is effective and it has good outcomes, then even if the citizens haven't been asked about it, haven't voted on it, it's legitimate. Similarly, if the citizens have voted for a really stupid policy that doesn't work at all, it is still legitimate because the citizens voted for it. So those are the trade-offs. But with the last criterion, which is the procedural criterion, another logic works. But first, what is this? It's the quality of the processes. So I call it throughput legitimacy. It's actually a term that David Easton came up with, but was very narrowly used as kind of bureaucratic administrative procedures. And what occurred to me is there's so much on output and input, but then people talked about accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, even efficacy in very different contexts. And I thought, if we can put these all under sort of a procedural criterion, call it throughput, then we can ask, so what are the relationships between throughput, input, and output? And what I discovered is actually they're really not the same trade-offs, because if you have good quality processes, they're essentially invisible. The people don't see them. They just see, we asked for this and here, good outcomes. So assuming that there's good accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, all normative standards, and then on top of it, a technical standard efficacy, then you just get good performance. That's the assumption. The problem is that, of course, it's invisible. Citizens don't see it if it's good, but if it's bad, if the processes are seen as unaccountable, incompetent, biased, or even oppressive, then of course, what happens is that throughput legitimacy taints the output performance legitimacy and skews political perceptions and input legitimacy. And that's really, I think, important. It's also important in the EU, especially important because EU-level actors, in particular technical actors, have a tendency to assume all they need to have are good procedures, will be accountable, will be transparent, will be open and inclusive, the white paper on governance, and then we'll have good performance and everyone will be happy. Well, There is no necessary connection. And of course, in the Eurozone crisis, what happened was there was an assumption, all we have to do is double down on the rules, throughput legitimacy, there'll be good output performance, and then it doesn't matter that the people haven't voted on it. Au contraire is what we saw. Things didn't work out that way. So that's legitimacy in sort of as it applies to governing activity. One more slide on the kind of theoretical piece, because of course, legitimacy is complicated in the EU because it's a split level between the EU and the national level. So at the EU level, the split level of legitimacy is essentially the EU level is basically deals with output, with policy, effectiveness and performance, and throughput legitimacy in terms of the procedures. And it's the national level that you have politics that involves input legitimacy. So it's this kind of split that you can see in terms of this figure. And what happens, of course, is if there's politics at the national level and people are unhappy, and what we've seen is the politicization of Eurozone governance. At the bottom, we've seen growing Euroscepticism, which leads from the bottom up to an increasing constraining dissensus in the council. If you remember permissive consensus in the early years, citizens weren't consulted, but they didn't care or they didn't know. But the more they knew and the more the EU deepened its integration, the more questions arose, especially in the past decade of polycrises, not just the Eurozone crisis, but the refugee crisis and others, Brexit. And from the bottom up is really the kind of the post-functionalist theory. But importantly, politicization is not only at the bottom and moving from the bottom up, but it's also at the top. There's a new politicized dynamics of interaction amongst all EU institutional actors that goes beyond the kind of bottom-up politicization that you see within the council as member states respond to their citizens and increasing concerns, let's say, or Euroscepticism. At the top, this politicized dynamics of interaction involves the council wanting to be in charge, the commission, the ECB, perhaps being in control, the EP, the European Parliament, seeking to exert greater influence. I mean, what's interesting here is that this is, if one reads the literature, a lot of the literature is about, that came up. A lot of the literature is intergovernmentalism versus supranationalism, arguing council in charge or supranational actors, commission and ECB in control, and a few parliamentarists saying, no, it's the European Parliament. And what I try to argue in this, in the particular chapter where I deal with this, and then seek to demonstrate, is that everyone is more political, that it's more politicized, but that everyone is also, all these actors are more empowered, and that there is a new politicized dynamics of interaction. And given that, the question for this is politicization a good thing or a bad thing? And to my mind, if you can say, you can argue it's a bad thing in terms of the content of the discourse. It's Wolfgang Schäuble, German Minister of Finance, complaining about the Commission, not applying the rules appropriately. The Commission saying, hey, we're a political commission, we can use our administrative discretion to do what we want, or the European Parliament complaining about both the Council and the Commission for not being legitimate enough. So what you could say is politicization, and I'm not even adding the partisan aspects. Politicization in terms of the substance of what is said could be seen as a bad thing. But the process itself could very well be seen as a good thing, because at least there's more debate, there's more contestation, and indeed even deliberation. And isn't that what democracy is all about? In some ways, the EU has become more like what we see at the national level, what citizens recognize as democracy. It is about not just deliberation, but contestation. So is politicization a good thing or a bad thing? Well, perhaps both. So moving on, the council. So to explain what I decided to do in the book is that I'm talking about legitimacy. How does one talk about legitimacy? What I want to do is say, well, I found so-and-so completely illegitimate, but that's not going to convince anyone. And that's not really a good way to talk about legitimacy. So I thought, to be fair, to be legitimate, what I needed to do was take a Janus-faced approach and take all of the arguments on the side that, for example, in the council, that its actions were illegitimate, and then all of the and then sort of say, but on the other hand, perhaps they were legitimate, and muster all of the arguments on both sides to allow the reader to make up his or her own mind. So in the council, the question is, is the council a dictatorship led by Germany with one-size-fits-one rules, i.e. rules that work for Germany? And one can make all sorts of arguments about Germany getting its economic interests, saving its banks, making the debtors pay for its own German banks' risky investments. We could also add French banks to this. But you could say but it's also about German political interests, in particular the CDU. Merkel delays on bailing out, on doing anything with Greece, and saying, oh, let Greece deal with its own problems, because there was a big election in May in North Rhine-Westphalia. And of course, think about the Constitutional Court. The German Constitutional Court is the only constitutional court in Europe that constantly said, well, we have something to say about this, and we don't think that this is actually okay. And then there is Merkel with Sarkozy, but Merkel leading, insisting, for example, on the European Stability Mechanism, which is, and demanding haircuts, which ended up essentially pushing Ireland and then Portugal also into programs. So that's the arguments for the dictator. But one could argue on the other side, but wait a minute. All of the member states were meeting all the time, deliberating, and they all agreed to this. All of them agreed to these policies. So could we argue that this is actually a mutually accountable deliberative body because they were deliberating, even if you want to argue that deliberation was in the shadow of Germany? And here, I think the most convincing arguments can be made, not so much in 2010, where there's a discourse of stability, but by 2012, you have Mario Monti going to the council and saying, we need growth, and Hollande backing him up. And then Merkel says, okay, growth with stability. And then Matteo Renzi, backed by Hollande, goes to the council and says, we need flexibility. And Merkel finally says, okay, flexibility within the stability rules. Finally, in 2015, you get Jean-Claude Juncker coming in and saying, we need investment, and you have that. So is the council a dictatorship or a deliberative body? You can ask questions. One can make arguments on both sides, and lots of scholars do. But what about the program countries? Here, there's not any good side of this Janus-faced. It's either harsh dictatorship for the third Greek bailout or deliberative authoritarianism. I really like this one. With regard to Ireland and Portugal and the first or second bailouts, because deliberative authoritarianism, basically, the various prime ministers were invited to deliberate, but then still everything was imposed. And the Troika and the Eurogroup, no question. The Eurogroup is, most egregious in some ways, given that it was an informal body that imposed and no one could say anything. And within that, one can see tremendous influence of Germany. And of course, it's Northern European alliance. We don't want to just blame Germany for this. So that's the council. What about the ECB? So here one could argue that it's the hero in terms of monetary policy, with its going from one size fits none rules to whatever it takes. And it does this hiding its reinterpretation of the rules in plain view. Remember that with Jean-Claude Trichet, it had an incredibly narrow definition of its mandate. No, we're not a lender of last resort. Can't be. We have to be credible. And then slowly but surely, in particular, once Mario Draghi comes in, you change the discourse to its stability in the medium term, and from no, we can't be a lender of last resort, you get to quantitative easing. A massive change. But what the hiding the reinterpretation in plain view is that Trichet says, this is our mandate. Draghi says, this is our mandate. This is our mandate. This is our mandate. So you get a wide interpretation. Changing, of course, the interpretation as we go on. So that sounds really good. But on the other hand, you can make an equally powerful argument saying that no, the ECB was the ogre of the crisis, pushing austerity on all member states and harsh austerity and structural reform on program countries. And on top of that, think about the lack of accountability. You know, this is a technical actor, and yet it demands a quid pro quo on fiscal consolidation. Okay, I'm breaking the rules, but don't tell anyone on, I'm breaking the rules on what my mandate is and breaking the no bailout clause. But in exchange, you, the member states, have to focus on rapid fiscal consolidation. And then on top of that, think about the lack of transparency. Trichet's secret letters to the prime ministers of Greece, of Spain, Italy, all basically saying, less Italy, which was, but basically saying, you know, if you don't self-impose, if you don't either go into a program or self-impose austerity for Spain and Italy, you know, basically will pull the plug on your economy. There's no legitimacy, no input legitimacy there. That's a decision for political actors, not technical actors. And there's, of course, a lack of efficacy. Waited way too long on becoming something close to a lender of last resort and doing quantitative easing. Remember that the Federal Reserve Bank, in the Federal Reserve in the US, the Bank of England had already started quantitative easing in 2008 and continued throughout that period. ECB doesn't start until 2015. What about the Commission? This is one of my favorite terms. Ayatollahs of austerity or ministers of moderation? I have to tell you that this study actually started when I was invited to apply for a part-time fellowship at the Directorate General of Economics and Finance in 2014. And the first event that I went to, we were all this 14 economists and me, were asked to do a presentation. So I started out by saying, you know, Paul Krugman likes to call you the reign of terror, as in Olli Rehn, but I prefer to think of you as Ayatollahs of austerity. They laugh, thinking I'm joking, but I'm not. But what was interesting is subsequently in interviewing them, and remember this is 2014-15, in interviewing, talking to people, what I realized is, no, actually something else is going on. Yes, I think you could argue that they're Ayatollahs of austerity from 2010 to 2012. They were the enforcers in the European semester with its one-size-fits-all rules. And certainly in the Troika, they were enforcers for the Eurogroup. But by 2013 on, they really became ministers of moderation. And because think about this, they found themselves between a rock, Northern Europe, and a hard place, Southern Europe. And as output performance failed, and for the Commission, this is all about legitimacy, they thought, what are we going to do? So they bend the throughput procedural rules in order to get better performance. And they become increasingly flexible. But in this period from 2013 to 2015, you still had Olli Rehn with a discourse that was Ayatollah-like. You know, harsh austerity and structural reform, even as they were giving derogations to the rules for France and Italy, allowing Spain to recalculate its numbers, etc. And so it got the reputation from the outside of still being hidebound, as being basically being the Ayatollahs. But in fact, they were ministers of moderation. When I said this in my third and last presentation in the summer of 2015, I said, I first thought of you as Ayatollahs of austerity, but now I've come to see you as ministers of moderation. They were very happy about that, needless to say. But it was interesting because when I went to talk to people, I said, how can you do this? And they said, but see what we say. Read what I said. Well, I see what you say. Ali Wren is talking about harsh. No. Read what we've said. Go to the annual growth survey. And then you actually see very clearly a pattern where they go from, it's fiscal consolidation is the headline goal throughout, till 2015. But on structural reform, massive change. As they start out with a very narrow view, basically crush the unions and cut the welfare state. By 2013, they're saying, bring in the social partners, talk to them, do anything you can. Think about poverty, think about inequality. Of course, everyone's still focused on fiscal consolidation. It doesn't necessarily do anything in terms of the performance, but in terms of the kind of the throughput procedures, what you do see is an important shift. Whoops. Anyway, that was about the Juncker Commission, and there is a shift. And what about the Parliament? Is it a talking shop with no size fits all, or an increasingly equal partner? I'm not going to talk about much about this, but it was essentially cut out at the beginning, but increasingly it became the go-to body for input legitimacy, in particular for the European Central Bank and the Commission, and it became an increasingly critical voice in reports and hearings. So now I'm going to go on to output legitimacy, because that whole section was about throughput legitimacy. So I'm going to go very quickly through this because I realize that I don't want to talk too long. So output legitimacy, and this is at the end of the book. Initially, it was going to be at the beginning, and I had 3 chapters of it, but I thought better put sort of the whole focus on the major focus on throughput legitimacy. And here, this is, what about the effectiveness of the policies? In fact, what you saw was a failures in framing, calling it public debt as a crisis of public debt, whereas it was actually a banking crisis, so private debt. But what happened then is it resulted in a misdiagnosis of the crisis, saying, well, if it's public debt, it means it's behavior, not following the rules, as opposed to the structure of the Eurozone. And the result was bad choice of remedies, doubling down on the rules, rather than really solving the crisis, i.e. through fiscal solidarity, such as Eurobonds, a European Monetary Fund, or what about? And of course, we can see the lack of effectiveness of the policy ideas in the policy performance and the outcomes. Increasing macroeconomic divergence between surplus and deficit countries, little or uneven growth, especially you can see that contrast with the US. Austerity and structural reform is a disaster, in particular for Southern Europe, given its different varieties of capitalism and growth models. And we see massive rise of unemployment in Southern Europe and rise of poverty and inequality everywhere. So that's output legitimacy. I think I've got to grab, you can see the output gaps, Germany versus Southern Europe. Germany's fine for the most part, and Southern Europe is basically off the bottom. What about input legitimacy? So here what we see is, and that's really the test, throughput is a problem, output is a problem. What about input legitimacy? Rising Euroscepticism, declining trust. We see these new cross-cutting cleavages. What are the sources of discontent? It's the socioeconomics of people feeling left behind, the sociocultural that feeds from the socioeconomics of a loss of status. Although you can also talk about worries about the changing faces of the nation and all the rest. And it's the politics of take back control, Brexit being the best example of that, and major political polarization, the decline of mainstream parties, and the rise of populist Eurosceptic extremes. And here's the share of the vote for Eurosceptic extremes, and you can see how they go up following the 2010 Eurozone crisis. So what about, to finish, legitimacy during COVID-19? In the beginning, it looks like the Eurozone crisis déjà vu all over again, to repeat myself. The member states pursue their own policies. They violate, but actually this is a good thing, they violate the Stability and Growth Pact rules on deficits. They end budgetary austerity with big infusions, and they violate the Schengen rules as well. So this even looks like the migration crisis redux. The council is unaccountable. It fails to act. The frugal four against grants. Germany sort of sits back and says, well, we're not in trouble. And Italy is desperate and disillusioned. The ECB, think about that moment, claims it's not its mandate to deal with the spreads between German and Italian bonds, and the Italian bonds, you know, go sky high. And of course, after the weekend, the ECB actually changes and immediately does the pandemic emergency purchasing program, but problematic. And the commission is nowhere. Of course, it has little governing authority in terms of health. And there are also the constraining economic rules. It has limited fiscal capacity. However, very quickly, and the EP has no role. Very quickly, however, it changes. The EU gets more governing authority. You can see a jump in the polls on citizen trust, and governing activities become more throughput legitimacy, the procedures in terms of accountability, although maybe not transparency, and output legitimacy, better performance. The council becomes a mutually accountable deliberative body without any sign of diktats. The Franco-German duo is back. Yes, there are the frugal four, but nonetheless, we break the taboo against EU-level debt. The ECB is a hero now without ogre-like qualities. It reverses all austerity that it had before, and without any of the quid quo pros from before, and bond buying without limit. And the commission, here we get ministers of moderation without any Ayatollah-like qualities. They suspend the deficit and debt rules following, sort of supporting what member states decide to do. They suspend state aid rules as well. They create SURE, so short-term employment support for all member states, and they propose an even bigger EU recovery fund than that proposed by the Franco-German duo, as well as an EU for health. And the European Parliament, perhaps more of an equal partner or still a talking shop. You know, again, very little at the beginning, but in the budgetary negotiations, it does play a role in pushing for rule of law and for more money back into the budget on health. So reforming the Eurozone, here are a variety of suggestions. I don't really think we have time to talk about this, no, but anyway, more fiscal solidarity. Think about Euro bonds, green bonds, helicopter money even. That will never happen. But a true unemployment guarantee fund, individual deposit insurance, there's still not that, despite everything. There is a banking union at least. And we need not just a temporary pandemic investment fund, but a permanent EU investment fund for the green transition, for the digital transformation, and to combat social inequality. So those are on output side. On the throughput processes, I always say get rid of these stupid rules. But if you can't do that, at least make the EU rules numbers guidelines. But the rules, the numbers themselves don't work at all. And yet problematically, they are sprinkled throughout the treaties now. The EU semester needs to be reversed. And it's actually already changed because now it's an investment vehicle rather than a hierarchical control vehicle, but it needs to be more bottom up, turning, say, the competitiveness councils into industrial policy councils and bringing in the social partners in civil society. I don't see any other way to combat populism. And the ECB, you could have some kind of great macroeconomic dialogue where it sets differential targets, but in coordination and in deliberation with the Council, the Commission, the European Parliament, and perhaps the citizens too, to make all of this much more legitimate. And more avenues for input, end the unanimity rule through supermajorities with opt-out, take the treaty-based Eurozone rules, turn them into ordinary legislation, have more co-decision. So bring the European Parliament in and enable it to have oversight over the new instruments such as the resilience, Resilience and Recovery Fund. And there should be more and better linkages between the European Parliament and the national parliament. So to conclude, what next? There's still some way to go. Governing by rules and ruling by numbers for the moment is only suspended. Watch out for the fiscal hawks, the frugal 4+. In 2 to 3 years, actually, they're already coming back, starting to talk about debt. One should see spending not as more debt, but rather as investment for growth. The Eurozone, on top of this, still lacks the necessary instruments for optimal performance. There needs to be a permanent EU-level bond capability, individual deposit insurance. The ECB should finally become a real lender of last resort and focus on its secondary mandate, which is about employment, which is about greening the economy, etc. And the EU is still not sufficiently democratically legitimate. The EP needs more power. No taxation without representation, I suppose. The populist revolt is not over, especially when we start talking about challenges to the rule of law, in Hungary and Poland. But at least the COVID crisis response reverses some of the worst legitimacy lapses of the Eurozone. So I think I'm ending on an optimistic note. Thank you. At least a good start. So now I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you very much, Vivien. C'était très riche. Alors, je donne tout de suite la parole à Morgane et tu vas pouvoir poser tes questions.
Okay. Vivien, thank you very much. Should I go in English or in French? I can go in English. I will go.
It's up to you. It's up to you. I mean, whatever the audience prefers.
I'm fine with English, and I think, as you said, it's the vocabulary of your research and the vocabulary of the book, so it makes sense to me. Okay, well, first I wanted to thank you very much, Vivien Schmidt, for being here in Nantes, virtually at least, and thank you very much, Arnaud, for giving me the opportunity to discuss such a stimulating book. So Vivien Schmidt, it was a pleasure to read the book because your research has been accompanying my own since I was a grad student, and I'm currently applying the discursive institutionalism to the ECB and to the Eurozone in the frame of my own doctoral thesis. So it was a very enjoyable opportunity to plunge through your book and through all these new data and empirical, quantitative, but also qualitative material that you collected, notably from your experiences inside the commission, I guess, or from current academic literature. So it was a good experience. Now to my questions. I absolutely adhere to the discursive institutionalism framework to explain how the dominance of epistemic repertoires frame policy options. But somehow, at the end of the book, I caught myself thinking, well, what you show of how member states and citizens responded to the Eurozone crisis might actually have me switch to rational choice institutionalism to understand citizens' core preferences. And this might actually also be applicable to the functioning of the Eurozone as a whole. I quote page 240 here, where you write, "There are good rationalist logics for member states to cooperate in a mutually beneficial risk-sharing insurance union based on diversity and inequality, where the members could better ensure their economic prosperity together than they could apart." So you quote Schelkler on here. And this rational choice perspective would, I think, explain a lot, such as what are the ends of the European integration? Because if we understand it this way, then the ends of the European integration, well, it's just higher economic prosperity without too many losses. And that would be it. So this rational choice perspective is somehow reinforced also when you show with data how the European citizens that most suffered economically from harsh austerity, they actually still support the EU and the Euro. Such as, so you name Ireland, Spain, and Cyprus, for instance. And according to, so you quote Sarah Hobolt and Christopher Vratil, the reasons for these citizens' continued support for the Euro had increasingly less to do with the Euro's link to identity and increasingly more to do with self-interest. A utility-based logic rather than an identity-based logic explains better why, despite the crisis, the public support remained strong. So of course, ideas still matter. And the rest of the demonstration, I thought, was impeccable to lead the reader into understanding how the austerity paradigm was rooted and then evolved by stealth, notably via the influence of new leaders and new practices, new ideas, and new interpretations of the rules in key institutions, such as the ECB, the Council, the Commission. But it seems that interests matter a lot in times of crisis as well. And you explain in great details episodes of intergovernmental crisis, such as the Greek one, for instance, where each member state's self-interest protections skyrocket, sometimes having them betray previous ideology commitments. So it is, I'm afraid it's probably too schematic to oppose in such an antagonistic way, interests in a way and ideas on the other way. But it helped me frame one apprehension that I had when I was reading the book, which is that maybe chasing the austerity paradigm away and making room for social-oriented policies and solidarity alternatives might not be enough if it isn't framed in terms that will serve each participant's interests in a very obvious way. And due to the crisis of confidence following the debt crisis, for instance, where surplus countries have shed light on their sort of phobia of moral hazard, do you think that the solidarity options are really still on the table? I mean, in pragmatic terms. Maybe I should just reframe the question. What if increasing participatory opportunities for national parliaments, for national lobbies, and for citizens groups led to even less solidarity policies? So I'm sure it's a question that you've been asked a lot, but I'm curious to have your views on this. What if extra input and throughput legitimacy were to degrade output legitimacy, especially if we include, for example, a stronger veto power for national parliaments? Do you think a more solidarity-oriented EU is a reachable horizon? At which conditions, for instance, would Germany, the Netherlands, or Sweden allow it? My second question is related to my own monetary interests, so it's going to be about the ECB. So I really learned a lot from the second part of the book, where you draw this on this discursive analysis that you actually did in order to capture how the ECB spoke from 2010 and on in answering the crisis, how the discourse moved from credibility to stability, and how the change in direction led by Draghi paved the way for new possibilities, and to some extent, somehow it freed the institution from a past ordoliberal ideology. It remained, but it sort of freed it to some extent. I have two questions on that matter. The first one is, do you believe that the ECB could again be originating in innovative monetary policies after all the contestation that arose following OMT announcements and now QE, notably from Karlsruhe? And isn't its legitimacy too much at risk now for this? In addition, as you recall, I think you quote Benjamin Brown and Leo Downey, and they have shown how the ECB didn't seize the moment on purpose, the moment of the crisis, how it actually wasn't willful actors enjoying a window of opportunity, but it was more of an emergency firefighter ad hoc reaction to a crisis situation that had never been anticipated, and they had no tools to resolve, to answer to. And although it gained power and output legitimacy in the process in a way, the ECB may have suffered from betraying actually its ideological roots in doing QE. And do you think the ECB is a good institution to look at for innovative solutions? My concern is also fueled somehow by a study I read from Clément Fontaine and others that analyzed the academic and professional training of the ECB board and staff. So obviously, it showed little diversity inside the institution. So basically, there was a bit of Chicago school, a bit of Austrian economics, and a minority of Canadians inside, the European Central Bank staff. They also looked at the ECB academic publications from 2014, I think, and they identified that creative tools and new instruments appealing to non-mainstream economics, such as you mentioned, helicopter money, for instance, were almost inexistent from the ECB's research. And in this regard, how would you feel about innovative perspectives from the ECB? Should it come from the inside or from the outside? And if the ECB is autonomous in selecting the experts it works with, how is there any guarantee that an epistemic diversity will be reached? I'd be very happy to listen to your views on this. And my last question, and then I think I'm done. My last question is a follow-up on this. I absolutely adhere to the idea that the ECB could only gain legitimacy from somehow opening the black box and communicating on what they do, be sensitive to member states' apprehensions, listen to parliament's preferences, and be more accountable to citizens, perhaps. But isn't that in absolute contradiction with the independence requirement of this super independent agency, probably the most independent central bank in the world? And isn't that a risk to delegitimize the institution in other regards? The ECB seems to be caught here between a rock and a hard place. If it becomes more political, more subject to influences and ideas, it loses independence. And if it loses independence, it loses both throughput legitimacy via, for instance, influenced channels. They're going to claim that they cannot be influenced, and they're going to lose input legitimacy via this respect for German preferences, for instance, or the will that is expressed in the treaties. And a lot of energy is currently spent by the ECB to demonstrate again and again its neutrality, even its ideological neutrality, almost to the point where they refuse to be reproached with having a conception of what is fair and what is not. They're bound by their numbers. That's what they claim. They're bound by their numbers, and they absolutely refuse to be associated with conceptions of good and fair. And they reject the idea of being influenced by anyone. So apart from the order liberal ideas that it inherits from history, the ECB always calls upon its neutrality. So the way I tend to see it nowadays is that the ECB is progressively shifting towards a more political agenda, but only in verbatim. So they now include concerns about inequality in their speeches, including ecological concerns as well. But it doesn't seem to be a gain in whether input or output legitimacy. They get autonomously, they get to decide what matters, but they stick to their neutrality rule and they're governing by numbers. So my question for you would be, is there any reason to be optimistic about the ECB playing a role in inequality reduction or green transition at all without treaties modification? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Morgane. Viviane, beaucoup de questions. Alors, c'est parti.
Beaucoup de questions, des questions fantastiques. Great questions. So much to respond to. So I guess I'll take them from the very beginning. And so what's really interesting is that your definition of interests is a rationalist one. Whereas as a discursive institutionalist, I'm just saying these are all ideas about interests. And that and that essentially what one needs to do is essentially convince people that their interests are different from what they think they are. And if you look at what's happened over time, actually, if you look at the shift with COVID-19, that's exactly what happened. Just to give you a sort of a small example of that, but an important one, what happens at the beginning of the crisis is Merkel is back to, this is path dependency of ideas, if you will, an historical institutionalist account of her rationalistic approach. Okay. It's still, in this beginning, it looked like it could have been seen as an asymmetric crisis. Should Germany do anything after all? And everyone doubles down. They close borders. Germany says, oh, well, we're not allowing anyone to get our masks. France does the same. This looks like a totally rationalist thing, right? It's all about our interests. But was that really in anyone's interest? And what happens is Macron, we're going to be nice to Macron for once, okay? Macron is desperate to try to get Merkel to change his mind, but he engages, as Amandine Crespi and Olivier Strom have a really interesting article where they show that there was tremendous diplomatic efforts at every level of the diplomacy getting involved with the Germans.
Viviane, vous a perdu.
With solidarity. That this was a symmetric crisis, not an asymmetric one, that this is very different from the previous crisis, and that, that the virus knows no borders and no boundaries. And in fact, fascinatingly, Merkel changed her mind. So we might ask what made her change their mind, and we can provide a number of different possible explanations for this. And that's what's interesting about all of this. So, you can argue, in The Economist and the chef de cabinet of Paolo Gentiloni, Marco Butti, in a talk that I moderated, said, well, she changed her mind because of enlightened self-interest. Well, he would, because he's an economist. And yes, it's enlightened self-interest. And, as part of that, you can say, German automotive manufacturers immediately said, listen, we've got to do something. This is an interdependent economy. We need our Italian, suppliers, car parts manufacturing suppliers, to provide us the parts, especially the Bavarian automotive industry. You've got to do something for Italy as well. So enlightened self-interest. But you could also argue that, look at Merkel. She was the dictator, definitely, with Wolfgang Schäuble, all about, our economic self-interest on the, making the debtors pay in the Eurozone crisis. But think about Fukushima. And, just like that, she said, Germany's not going to do any more nuclear power, regardless of the cost. And then think about the refugee crisis. Everyone's throwing up their barriers, and she said, no, wir schaffen. We can do it. And she takes in 1 million Syrian refugees. That's about so it's a different set of ideas. You could say it's emotion. There's a whole literature on that. You could say it's not enlightened self-interest in that narrow, or it's a different set of ideas that are applied. And so I think that this is really important for your question about solidarity. Solidarity, can be understood in many different ways, and it can be understood in terms of rationalist self-interest as well. And when you noted, which I have in the book as well, that people said, well, it's in our self-interest, so we're supporting the euro. Well, they're not supporting it because they like it. In fact, in many cases, they hate the euro, but they see no alternative. So even there, it's not as if it's in their self-interest, except that they know that leaving the euro is not in their self-interest, puts them in worse shape. So I think that probably is sort of a sufficient response to your first question, which is a wonderful question. And yes, and I do get these all the time. And as part of that, I should go on to say that within the context of my work in discursive institutionalism, I didn't put this in the book because, there are just limits to how many theoretical things that you want to put in a book. I thought about it, I thought, no, but in other work I've done in co-authorship with Martin Carstensen, we talk about different ways of thinking about ideas and the power of ideas. So it's, and so there are three kinds of, there are three ways of thinking about the power of ideas. One is what I usually think of when I work on, when I'm talking about discursive institutionalism, which is the persuasive power of ideas and discourse, persuasive power of ideas through discourse. So it's about normative justification, cognitive justification, normative legitimation, and convincing the other, persuading them that this is the way, as Macron sought to persuade Merkel and successfully did persuade her to take another tack, and then to break, the massive taboo of your EU level debt. So that's one. But there's another way of thinking about ideas, which is coercive power over ideas and discourse. And that's probably closer to the rationalist view. And that is essentially, you control the media, you basically, whether you believe it or not, you force people to do it, but because you provide no other information. This is Orban essentially controlling 80–90% of the media in Hungary. So everyone ends up voting for him because what else? They don't know any better. Or Berlusconi in Italy controlling, 3/4 of the media. But of course, there's another way of thinking about this coercive power over ideas, and that's social movements. The power of the weak to essentially force people in power, to shame them into changing their policies. So there's also, so it's essentially coercive power of ideas is, like it or not, you change your ideas and discourse because of this pressure. The third type of power is power in ideas, the power to structure thought. This is definitely Foucault and Bourdieu, that sort of dominant ideas sort of blind people to any other possible ideas. This is ordoliberalism. This is Germany, basically. This is the Bundesbank. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. We know what the consequences, they're all good if you remain with the Stability and Growth Pact. And narrowly, debt is bad, debt is always bad. Austerity will get you growth. What? We have 10 years to demonstrate that it didn't, but still. And that's the structural power in ideas, but there's also the institutional power in ideas and discourse, which is more the historical institutionalist approach, which is the embedding of ideas in the rules, which is the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the way in which German rules, ordo-liberal ideas, migrate from the Bundesbank to the ECB, which then gets us to your ECB question, which is, again, a great question. And that's about innovation. And actually, so this works pretty well in terms of, if we think about these different kinds of different ways in which ideas and discourse have power. We can also talk about the ECB and the way in which it actually, what about the persuasive power? Either if we see the ECB as essentially blinded by its ideas, by ordoliberal ideas, then we'll see no change. But I rather see Draghi coming in as having a different set of ideas. He's a firefighter. He is not necessarily, Trichet, Jean-Claude Trichet isn't even an economist. He's an administrator. He goes to the ENA, he doesn't know economics, and he does an apprenticeship in the Banque de France, which was independent, and then all of a sudden, it's not. And then he goes to the ECB. He believes all these rules, the no bailout clause. And so he has to do something, but he does as little as possible. Draghi comes in. Draghi's history is very different. He's been at Goldman Sachs. He's been called in as a firefighter to solve the Bank of Italy problems. He then comes in and, yes, there are ogre-like qualities, but he also doesn't necessarily, he's about the persuasive power through ideas. The best example of this is, how do we explain the fact that when Draghi gets there, there is a blocking coalition around the Bundesbank that means that nothing can be done? Austerity, austerity, austerity. Very shortly, Draghi has isolated the Bundesbank. Jens Weidmann is really upset because he's got no clout anymore. As the ECB is changing, is becoming more and more expansive in its monetary policy. It's quite extraordinary how it changes. And he's got, and he's got the gift of the gab. He's got the discourse. I'll do whatever it takes to save the euro. And then he doesn't have to do anything because the markets back off, thinking that the ECB is a lender of last resort, and it's not. But don't tell anyone. The markets believe it. That's all that counts. And he does more and more and more, which is why the German Constitutional Court gets so angry, and why German economists go to the Constitutional Court, and the Bundesbank supports this, because we've got to stop the ECB doing what it's doing. But we also, again, have to ask, and your question was really good about, where do these ideas come from, or how does this change? My guess, but this is for you to discover, my guess is that what the ECB does, especially because it's got this sort of narrowly trained staff. Cornel Ban did a great study where he compares the IMF to the ECB, and the IMF is much, much more open to a whole set of new ideas than the ECB. But of course, that's the research branch. If you look at the IMF operations, they're as narrow-minded as they come, especially in the Greek case. So, it's even more complicated than all of this. But my guess is that how Draghi, one of the ways in which Draghi manages to change the ideas is that he opens it up to, sort of epistemic communities of central bankers. They're going all over the place, looking and being open to new ideas from the outside, and presumably more unorthodox, non-standard ideas. I don't want to say heterodox, because that, it can't go that far. So I think that's really important. So it's leadership, but it's also opening up to a larger epistemic community and networks of influence that serves to legitimate him as a technical actor. But also, and this we know even from press accounts, that Draghi was very careful informally to go talk to the other actors. Before he says, I'll do whatever it takes, he's talked to Merkel and to Sarkozy. I'm thinking of doing this. And he said it a couple times before the markets even actually hear what he said. So I think that's important. So the ECB is indeed a political actor, but of a particular kind. Does this mean that it loses its independence? No, because it still decides what it's going to do, but it is more and more politically savvy. It is more interactive. This is what I've been talking about, the politicized dynamics of interaction at the top. The ECB is, it's the 5 presidents report, and the ECB is one of these presidents. So it means that this was the Trichet discourse. This was Duesenberg and Trichet, credibility. We can't talk to anyone. We don't do politics. ECB is doing lots of politics, but it doesn't say it. It doesn't have to. The people who need to know. But at the same time, it's also going to the European Parliament. It is doing more of its persuasive discourse for legitimation. It's looking for accountability. Its accountability forum is the European Parliament. And that's really important. And it goes there on purpose, because that way it can communicate to the public at large. It gains more legitimacy. It develops its accountability by talking to the input legitimate forum, which it has to talk to, which is the European Parliament. And that's also really important. So in my pie in the sky, hopeful, here's how we can solve the Eurozone problem and COVID-19, et cetera, by having this great macroeconomic dialogue. The ECB can still maintain its independence. There can be the dialogue, and then it decides. That's my way of saying it maintains its independence, don't worry. But the great macroeconomic dialogue is actually to provide a cover for the ECB to actually do some of these secondary objectives. Because for the moment, it's kind of hesitant. It's, it doesn't know if it has the authority to, to do neutral bond buying, to do green bonds, to focus on employment. So my idea is have a great macroeconomic dialogue, bring everyone in, new ideas, and it can use that then as its legitimation for moving on the secondary objectives. For the moment, there's a discussion, but they haven't done anything. Why? Because they're thinking, we've got the Germans, exactly as you were saying, we've got the Germans, the Finns, the Dutch, they're going to complain. We've gone basically as far as maybe we can go, except they've also, think about it, they've gotten rid of the bond buying ratios that they had claimed they had to stick to, that they themselves invented. But that's gone too with the pandemic. So this last step, which all central banks are now talking. There's a big discussion among central banks about what we do to go farther in secondary objectives. And for the ECB, it would mean employment, but other central banks already have that as a primary objective. For the ECB, that would be more, but also on greening the economy, on issues of inequality, tremendously important. So for that reason, more democracy, more democratic macroeconomic dialogue, but the ECB can still claim its independence. It can do it or not, saying it's in our mandate, it's not in our mandate. It's all about ideas and the power of persuasion. But you're never going to persuade the German economists, probably. There's too much power in ideas there, structuring power in ideas. But new generations, they need to come to France to do their economics as opposed to staying in Germany. And I stop there.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Muriel, vas-y, tu as pris la parole. Je suppose que tu poses tes questions.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think this presentation, in addition to reading the book, the presentation is very helpful because it puts the dynamic in perspective. And thank you also, Morgane, for your very good questions on the role of ideas, because this is a very dense book, and so this allows me to put things in perspective. I really I want to recognize the tremendous work that is behind this book, Vivien. It's amazing. You've read everything, and everything is in that book. So if you were looking for a kind of theological sum on European legitimacy, look no further. It's there. This is the book. You have absolutely everything, and this lens of legitimacy still allows her to deal with the latest, theoretical approaches. So it's maybe not your beach novel, but certainly a very good reference textbook. Now, I think I'm going to be pretty short in the number of things that I want to say. Another introductory remark is that I want to say that I experienced the Euro crisis in the US. I was living in the US. And, referring to the role of ideas and perception, it's very incredible how different perspectives can be there and in the EU. So in the US, it was all about stop this stupid austerity. You need stimulus. You need, it was the Eurozone is not an optimal economic zone, so it was doomed to fail. And the difference, and I was suffering very much when living there because I could see that they were talking, good sense, and the Europeans looked absolutely crazy and stuck in their stupid roles. I'll go back to that point more seriously with you, Vivien. So the role of perceptions, and I want to share an anecdote because I read in the book page 110, you share this interview with a German banker, Vivien, talk about German bankers and how stubborn they are. So you insist that the only way to reform is through increasing flexibility in labor markets and lowering wages to make Greece export competitive, even if it goes to 30%. Yes, says the economist, and then you see that he's ready to torture Greek people without even realizing what's going on. I had the same kind of experience with a student whom I was pushing to go out of his comfort zone about Greece and inflation and austerity. And I can testify that I could push him a bit, but not too much. There's this saying that Germans are traumatized by inflation and that they fear inflation more than cancer. And it's true. And you can't imagine how this puts blinkers on people. It's difficult, and it was extremely distressing when I was living there in the US, because all the people to whom I was talking, including a common friend, your colleague at the Center for European Studies, Vivien, what's his name, is very charming though, and is also a social democrat. But be that as it may, he's extremely orthodox. And there is this kind of very weird conversation going on between a French and a German, where you see that there is no possible dialogue. So this is for the anecdote. Now, having said that, I want to go back to this. I want to ask you, Vivien, why you chose to develop so much throughput legitimacy, as understood as governing with the people, and understood as a procedural kind of legitimacy, because in the end, you kind of entice us to ditch it away. And I would say something a bit provocative, and I will develop this a bit further. Your book, as an academic book, is the best suggestion, or let's say I found the best case for populist political approaches, or your book is the best defense of a populist case against EU rules, Vivien. And I'm saying this in a provocative way, of course, but I think it speaks to a lot of drawbacks and terribly stiff rules that the EU has developed, and that are part now of the liberal package of democracy, that those populists are questioning. But reading you, I really thought, but they're right to question that package, because this is unbearable. And so I was, you remember that seminar, which was 10 years ago? I invited you to discuss transnational democracy at the Ash Center. We had this seminar, and you were actually, I think it's the first time I heard you present or mention those throughput and decline the three aspects of legitimacy. At the time, we didn't really have time to discuss this, but I remain puzzled by this throughput thing. And I really want to ask you, why do you insist so much on those rules and on giving an account of throughput legitimacy in the EU over the past 20 years, even if I understand that it's important for you to show that maybe they recognize that their rules were not working and they bent them. But I've not been very convinced by the explanatory power of throughput, because I think they very much encompass either a bit of input and a lot of output. But also your solutions at the end of the book, where the solutions that you briefly touched upon right now, a better EU governance for the future, meaning more differentiated, more dialogue, more social responsibility, etc. These are actually output solutions. These are better policies. And these policies come at a moment now with the COVID. I agree with you totally that the COVID is a very welcome shock, which shows us a much better picture of what the EU can do in a crisis. And maybe because it's totally new, and maybe because it's in a field where the EU had no competence no, past dependency in their know-how, with all the bureaucrats enshrined in decision-making processes, so full of them, of their power, of their roles, which are actually absolutely stupid in face of a new event. Like here, I'm trying to be a bit Harentian, what does the EU do in face of novelty, in face of events, of something that never happened? Well, so far it did not fare very well. But with the COVID, and here I agree with you, and I think it's very strong, maybe because it also threatens member states at the very core of their existence, because it's about security, about health, about life. And because this is an absolutely crucial field where the EU has no real competence, then it reacts with the strength of desperation, like Draghi. And so this is, my provocative 2 cents. I think you really, really like it or not, or maybe I'm not sure you want to do that, or you want to do it by stealth to argue for a much more political approach to Europe. I think this is what you're really trying to do, not in a populist case. And then I think I want to mention a third, maybe ask you a few, or point maybe a few missing actors in your very detailed and very instructive and informative picture of the EU. There's a couple of people or actors that I don't see in this book, and I think it's too bad, because I think they can have an important role, and they are part of the politicization of the EU. And what is too bad is when we talk about politicization of the EU, we always bring about the populist and blah blah blah, the same usual suspects. But also part of this trend of politicization are civil society movements, such as Polish women who react very strongly against abusive national powers, and who go in the street to protest against laws against the abortion, and they actually obtained something against the populist government. So these social movements, you just mentioned them, but they're not really in your book, or maybe I missed them. Another aspect of another actor that is missing, maybe, and you just mentioned this also very briefly with the green bonds, is one type of policy that might wake up Europe. It's the green policies. Green policies will absolutely wake up Europe, wake up young people, mobilization of young people who are already making some noise and demanding things from the institutions. I don't know if you came across this picture, and maybe Morgane, you have seen that, when a young German activist invaded one meeting of the EC, of the European Central Bank, and she burst into the meeting. Have you seen that picture? It's a great picture. She's a young woman, and she goes into there. She bursts into the meeting, and she's like, "Bam! This is unfair. What are you doing?" This, for me, this captures this is the spirit of what the young generation will do. And maybe that's not your usual politics, but this happened. And so I haven't seen this picture in your book, Vivien. Where is the young lady who disrupted the ECB? Last thing. I think really that your book calls for but does not really develop on that, and maybe you need to write another book, or we write it together. I think what is needed here in Europe is Europe is right for leadership, and Draghi is the best illustration of political leadership. Like, this guy, he's not only, he did all you said he did, but he is a great, talented political banker. He's really cunning. He's more intelligent than everybody else around him. And this shows us that when you have someone in charge who has ideas, who has leadership qualities, who has a political sense of the institutions there, you can change things. You can do something. So I was very relieved to see Super Mario arrive, but I'm also, the way I'm kind of relieved to see a woman, and a kind of interesting woman in charge of the commission, of the EU Commission, because I think people and talented people with political visions matter. And I think we've had them over the history of the EU. And we need to talk more about those people, because they give flesh to the EU. They are the EU, and they have been, in various institutions. And I think they're missing a bit in the picture that you give us, which is nevertheless an excellent, exhaustive, super informative picture. And I stop here. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Vivien. Est-ce qu'on peut faire des réponses un tout petit peu courtes pour qu'on laisse du temps aux questions du
Tout à fait. Tout à fait, sans problème. Yeah, no, thanks, Muriel. Wonderful comments. And I'm going to start with leadership and come back. And actually, part of the reason for not talking about leadership is because there was so little decent leadership. You know, it's, but I want to sort of come back to that and the issues of ideas, because you mentioned the sort of the German focus on fear of inflation. And remember, that's invented in the 1950s. That is that sort of, it recreates the memory of 1923 hyperinflation, when you had to have a wheelbarrow full of marks in order to buy a loaf of bread. You know, why do they remember that rather than 1931, deflation, high unemployment, and the rise of Hitler? You know, and it was something that Martin Wolf writes in an editorial in 2010 or 11, and he's absolutely right. And so it's about, you know, what are the stories people tell? And that's also about leadership. So I have just a funny story I put in there on leadership, or the lack thereof. Merkel, you know, when the Greek crisis is ballooning out of control, and what does she do? She follows the media feeding frenzy and agrees, yes, it's lazy Greeks versus we Germans who save. And I remember, I think in 2011, I was at a conference at Brown, and I say, here's what Merkel should have said. Rather than following the media feeding frenzy, she should have talked about the interdependence of the Eurozone. But how do you illustrate that for the German citizens? Well, she could have said, look, you need to understand that the Eurozone before the crisis was like a bar with a never-ending happy hour. And so it may very well be true that the Irish, the Spanish, and the Greeks were like drunkards on a binge. But who were the bartenders? German banks, French banks. You know, that's the kind of, anyway. What happened was National Public Radio picked it up, and they got rid of the first part of that. So they got rid of Irish, you know, so it became Spaniards and Greeks were on a drunken binge. They got rid of, yeah, I guess politically correct. But then they brought on a South Boston Irish bartender and said, so you heard that, what would you say about this? He said, well, she, you know, absolutely right. You know, I'm liable if my customers go out and have an accident. I go to jail just like they do. Therefore, you know, German and French bankers are just as much to blame as the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Irish. But I use that in illustration to say that's what leadership is. It's not simply following the media feeding frenzy of the tabloids. It's essentially exercising, which, as we discussed, she did in the COVID-19 crisis, and it turned the population around. So yes, leadership, but there were not that many, you know, Draghi, yes, and I do talk about him as the hero of the crisis. But really important question you ask is why I chose to develop Throughput. And I did because it seemed to me that was needed as a category to understand, in particular in the EU, the whole emphasis on procedures above all, and the way in which different EU actors essentially focused on the procedural above all. So I gave you the example earlier of, you know, in particular, commission civil servants simply assumed that all you need to do is double down on the rules. But that's the commission. But even the council, if you look at the council, you get both in 2010, 11, you get both Merkel and Sarkozy saying, hey, we're the most democratic body. Sarkozy actually says it, basically, this is the way in which we need to, because we truly represent the citizens, as if this were an input representative forum. And Merkel then says, I really like this European Union method, as if this is input legitimate. It's not. The best you can say, and I'm really searching, the best you can say for the council is that it may be a mutually accountable deliberative body. Because mutual accountability, they're all there talking, but then that requires deliberative accountability of the kind that Jane Mansbridge and others talk about, where it's got to be equal, fair, et cetera, which it's not. So even there, it's in the shadow of Germany in this early period, but you might still want to argue. So that's why the focus on throughput on throughput legitimacy, because it was missing in most of the accounts. And I do see it as a separate thing. Yes, one can talk about some elements of input appear to be part of it, some elements of output. And in fact, most of the literature doesn't distinguish, because Don Domenico Maione puts it in the output, others put it in the input, but I see it as a separate category, at least analytically. All three actually meld together. But it's useful analytically to be able to say, this is what they're really doing. And then I should admit that when I first was writing the book, I was going to start with output legitimacy, the policies, and then go to the politics, and then at the end and say, why were the policies a mess and the politics a mess? Well, it was because here they were governing by rules and ruling by numbers, assuming that this was procedurally legitimate. And that it would be, that was essentially why. But in fact, I ended up, by the time I finished the book after way too many years, most people had written the output legitimacy story about political economy. And there was so much on the politics and the rise of populism that I just thought, okay, no, I've got to and I also had 175,000 words, and I thought, oh my God, and I hadn't even finished yet. And I thought, oh no, this isn't going to work. So I thought, what would be my contribution? And it's on the throughput. But you're right to ask the question, because actually, I too think of output and input as the most important terms. Political legitimacy and performance legitimacy are the most important. But strangely enough, in the EU, throughput legitimacy was elevated to a very high level. So and what I wanted to say, that's highly problematic. So, and then you say that I've made the best case for the populists. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right. I see, this Eurozone crisis was a major crisis of legitimacy. What they did was, you can explain it in rationalist terms, and rational choice institutionalists don't think legitimacy matters at all. That's not part of your discussion. That's not what they do. But I think it matters tremendously, and clearly the citizens do too. And so that was part of the reason for actually saying, okay, let's ask it questions about legitimacy. And that takes us beyond. But yes, best case for the populace, but the EU went too far in the Eurozone. You don't have to reject the EU as a whole to recognize that it deepened integration in the wrong ways, and it needs to back off of that. It needs to re-decentralize and to democratize. This went, if you think about, my 2006 book, which is 2010, Démocratie en Europe, was very much focused on the impact of the EU on the member states and the problems of national democracy. And what the Eurozone did was essentially deepen the problems of national democracy, make them worse in terms of the loss of, sort of politics without policy, which has become politics against policy now with the rise of populism. And so, just to finish this, why didn't I talk about civil society movements and protests? I do a little bit here and there, but you're absolutely right. But there's limits. I was getting really tired by the end and thought, okay, I've got your input politics. I'll throw a lot of that in there, but I can't go on. And my new project is really focused on populism, in fact, to go beyond that. But what I did in that last chapter on input politics was just to show the connection between the problematic performance, the problematic procedures, and the throughput. And what happened in terms of the politics linked to the Eurozone. But of course, the populist revolt is a lot more than just the Eurozone. It's about immigration. It's about, it's about identity politics as well as the economics. But yeah, I should probably.
Thank you very much, Vivien. That was very, very informative in any case.
Merci beaucoup, Viviane. Alors, je propose que nous ouvrions la séquence questions. Qui veut se lancer? Renaud. Je vois une petite main. Renaud.
Le voilà. Here I am. Hello. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I must say that as a legal scholar, I was a bit frustrated because the law seems to be a bit of a blind spot in your analysis. And that was all the more surprising as the title of the talk was Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. So my first question would be, well, very, very general, but the EU has been thought as a legal institution before becoming a strange political body. So what do you have to say on this legal dimension? And my second question would be about the comparison we can draw with the role and the legitimacy of the federal government in the US, which historically grew thanks to very active monetary and economic policy. And so is there something we can learn from the US example, which itself goes through some difficult time when it comes to the legitimacy of the federal government? And yes, that's it. Thank you.
Merci, Renaud.
Yeah, so great questions. And as a legal scholar, you're right to be frustrated. But, again, there were just limits to what I could do. I do deal with legal issues on occasion, but it just could not be a central focus. The governing by rules and ruling by numbers. Just to tell you a little story, when I was at the Director General of Economics and Finance and interviewing all sorts of civil servants and basically asking them, why are you following these stupid rules? Can't you, be more flexible? And one high-level civil servant said to me, but Vivien, after all, rules are rules. So it's about, of course, the legal, it's the legal constraints, and I do talk about that. But what's interesting to me is the way in which, and that I do talk about at length, is the way in which all of these actors find ways to, if you will, circumvent the rules and the laws, or put a better way or different way, engage in a wide range of reinterpretations of using administrative discretion within the limits of the law to actually redefine it. And I think that's really so in that sense, there's a lot there in terms of the way in which they deal with the laws, with the rules, the no bailout clause, for example. I talk about at length, in various places, or not at length, but in various places, and talk about the fact that they kept saying that, the no bailout clause, we can't do anything. But there's a no bailout clause. Well, actually, if we buy debt on the secondary markets, we're not in violation of the no bailout clause. What? And they start, and that's the ECB doing it at the very beginning. And then the Commission, when the Council, when they are going to do this big bailout mechanism, they're going to bail out Greece, and then they're going to do the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Facility. They say, oh yeah, well, you can do this if for natural causes, if there's a major catastrophe of natural causes. Well, these are unnatural causes, but therefore we can have the contagion fund. But what they then do is say, oh, but yeah, there's still this no bailout clause. So we'll make sure that the bailout for Greece is above market levels. So let's punish them even more. No, no debt relief, nothing like that, because otherwise this would violate the bailout rules. And so they put it above market rates at 5.25, 5.75%, which is, impossible for them to pay, which is why the IMF gets upset. And in 2013, their research branch says, oh, we should never have done this because they could never have paid back their debt. Yeah, well, everyone knew that at the time, but it didn't matter. We have to save the euro, and therefore we bend the rules. So in a way, I am talking about the legal issues, but not directly, not from a legal scholar's point of view, but really this is all about how do you deal with the treaties and the laws and try to make this work without changing the treaties. And it's all about saving the euro. So who the hell cares about Greece? Anyway, Greece cheated, so we can punish them. But then, here's path to bend. Once you've punished Greece at that level, well, you're going to have to do the same for Ireland and the same for Portugal. And so it becomes a nightmare because of the way in which they have interpreted the law to tell themselves, we can't do this, but we can do that. And they're shoehorning it into, well, Germany doesn't want to have, we don't want a transfer union. And Finland, Netherlands, we don't want to do this either. So I guess that's my response on the legal stuff. And then on the role and legitimacy of the federal government, the US example, at various places in the book, I talk about that. And yes, for the US, of course, this took a very long time. And there's some very good books written on these comparisons. I think Valtrau Schelche talks a bit about the sort of the risk sharing mechanism and all of that. The one thing I could say is, this also speaks to what Muriel said, that, when she was in the US, as of course I was, all the American economists were banging on about, this is not an optimal currency area, and on and on and on. And in the book, I have this one figure that I just love, which was, I think, Morgan Stanley, that talked about optimal currency areas. And it was wonderful because, what was the most the best optimum currency area? Latin American countries, and then you get former English-speaking colonies, and then you get all countries above the X parallel, all countries beginning with the letter M, and then the EU. But what's interesting about this, the US isn't part of that, because the US is also not an optimum currency area. It's got massive differences, Mississippi, Alabama versus New York and California. But the US has a fiscal union. It's got redistribution. And the problem for the EU is that it needs to get to redistribution. What's quite amazing about the COVID-19 pandemic, I find amazing, is after all of this, terrible stuff during the Eurozone crisis. No, we're never going to have any kind of solidarity. All of a sudden, there's this massive breakthrough. And part of my explanation for that is that there are lessons learned. There was a real sense, no one's going to admit it, but the lessons learned were this is not working. And so you see the Commission doing everything it can and working on all sorts of ideas, plus climate change. But it can't get the major ones through. The most it can do is little bits and pieces and increasing flexibility and bending the rules as much as it can, and the kind of politicization of all of this as a result. But the big leap forward it can't do. COVID hits and all these ideas come out, and it's, a great moment of opportunity. And they seize that moment. And it's political actors. It's Macron, give him one little bit of credit here, with Merkel then.
Ursula, no?
And Ursula, absolutely. But, Ursula's just come in. It's really the Commission that has worked on this for a long time that comes in and says, here's some great ideas. Do it. EU for health. But most importantly, major investment in greening the economy, in digitalizing. Everyone's been talking about this, but nothing's happened. And this was the moment. So it's technical actors with new ideas. It's also leadership. So Ursula as well. And it's national actors exercising leadership. But yeah. So, but we're still not at the Hamiltonian moment. This is a new beginning, but we don't have Hamilton as yet. However, this may very well work. And I hear the Commission, I heard Commissioner Gentiloni saying, so long as everyone does their job and, we get growth, we're likely to get, a permanent investment fund, which is, of course, what the EU needs. And then I know maybe we're on the road to a kind of fiscal union that the US took so many years to get to as well.
Merci. Qui veut poser une autre question? En français ou en anglais? Ça veut dire la fatigue commence à arriver. Mais ça doit être le cas aussi pour Vivien.
Ça va.
Je relance une dernière fois. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut poser une question? Alors, moi, je voudrais vous en poser une, Vivien, une dernière.
Il y a aussi Clémence.
Il y a Clémence.
Clémence, je ne t'ai pas vu. Vas-y, Clémence, vas-y.
Oui, merci. Je la posais en français. Merci beaucoup pour votre présentation et aussi pour ce livre que je n'ai pas eu le temps de finir, mais que j'ai commencé. Et la discussion donne vraiment envie de le finir rapidement. J'avais une question d'ordre méthodologique. Je me posais. Vous dites que vous avez fait un fellowship à la DGACRIM, vous avez fait des entretiens et je me demandais si vous pouviez nous en dire plus, est-ce qu'il y a une façon particulière pour vous de faire des entretiens quand on est dans une perspective d'institutionnalisme discursif? Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a une méthodologie particulière qui est associée à cette perspective théorique? Et est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire un peu plus finalement sur les coulisses du livre avant d'en arriver à cette somme? Voilà, merci.
Merci pour cette question. Alors, vous savez, la méthodologie qualitative est très sensible aux idées du discours. On est là et on écoute quelles sont les idées, est-ce qu'elles se répètent, quel est le discours, quelle est l'angle de bois que moi je trouve toujours très important et très utile comme idée en fait. Et discours, c'est un peu qu'est-ce qu'ils disent, pourquoi est-ce qu'ils le disent. dans mes entretiens, mais là, depuis très longtemps, je fais toujours des entretiens. Quand j'ai fait mon livre sur la décentralisation en France, par exemple, j'ai parcouru la France, interviewé les gens et je posais certaines questions. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez du cumul des mandats? Très amusant, les réponses, par exemple. Jacques Médecin. Tous les autres disaient ah, je suis contre, mais c'est nécessaire. Je suis maire d'une ville moyenne. Ça, c'était Philippe Séguin. Jean-Marie Roche, c'est pas un problème. Mes gens font ma politique avec tous ces cumuls. Et seulement Jacques Médecin a dit « Ah non, je suis contre le cumul des mandats, mais c'est nécessaire pour me payer la teinturerie. Parce que je dois me changer 3 fois dans la journée et mettre le smoking le soir hein, pour me payer ça. Je dois faire député, même si je ne monte jamais à Paris. » Là, c'est génial. Quand j'ai fait mon livre sur From State to Market, j'ai interviewé une vingtaine, même trentaine de PDG de grandes entreprises. Et je leur posais la question, qu'est-ce que vous pensez des grands corps, du recrutement, de l'ENA et tout ça. Et là aussi, très intéressant en disant, ah, c'est un problème, mais... et puis, et là, je leur demandais, mais... Ah, vous avez dit ça, mais j'étais avec quelqu'un, Gallois, Louis Gallois, et il me dit, alors il a dit, mais c'est pas un problème, mais c'est vrai, ou peut-être il faut recruter plus, mais je lui dis, mais vous savez que Jacques Maison-Rouge de IBM a dit que vous avez tous les mêmes idées. Ah non, c'est pas vrai du tout. Et vous savez pourquoi il dit ça? Parce qu'il est centralien. C'est génial. Alors, méthodologiquement, qu'est-ce que je fais? C'est que j'essaye de poser des questions. Et puis, Gallois me dit, et moi, et Baudet au Trésor, on a des idées très différentes. Et bon, voilà. Mais c'est un peu ça. Alors, un peu de provoque. Mais vraiment écouter qu'est-ce qu'ils disent et avoir certaines questions qui peut laisser faire plus. C'est aussi vrai que comme américaine, mais qui parle français, ils se disent « Ah, je peux dire n'importe quoi parce que des américaines, ça compte pas. » Puis c'est une femme. En même temps que je parle assez bien le français, qui sont relax. Alors, ils disent presque n'importe quoi. C'est formidable. Ils disent des choses très intéressantes. Mais bon, ce qu'on peut dire, c'est que c'est vraiment faire attention à ce qu'ils disent, comment ils le disent, mais aussi au contenu. Est-ce qu'ils parlent du choix rationnel? Ou est-ce qu'ils parlent des émotions? Et voilà, c'est un peu ça. Mais c'est comme nous tous, dans les interviews, il y a les rapports humains, très importants. Mais aussi, et l'autre chose, c'est que j'ai certaines questions, je pose toujours les mêmes questions, au moins une quinzaine de questions. J'utilise finalement, s'il me laisse, j'utilise n'importe quoi, e-talk ou quoi.
Un enregistreur.
Voilà, un enregistreur. Mais s'il ne laisse pas, après, je prends des notes. Mais je pose toujours, après les 15 que j'ai dans ma tête, 2, 3 autres, comme ça. Parce qu'on ne sait jamais ce qu'il y a, des questions dont on a oublié. Et il y en a toujours. Alors, il faut revenir en arrière et leur demander des choses parce que les choses, les choses qu'ils disent pas, c'est souvent beaucoup plus important que les choses qu'ils disent ou aussi important. Une chose, c'est que quand je parlais au numéro 2 dans le ministère de l'Industrie, sur les personne parlait des boards. Je ne me rappelle plus des
bureaux.
Voilà, non, des boards of
Conseil d'administration.
Voilà, les conseils d'administration, les boards of directors. Personne n'en parlait, j'avais même pas pensé. Puis tout d'un coup, je me suis dit, mais pourquoi ils n'en parlent pas? Parce que ce n'est pas important. Mais je suis retournée pour lui poser les questions, mais vous ne parlez pas de conseil d'administration. Pourquoi? Ah, parce qu'on est toujours d'accord avant. Tout simple. Ce n'est pas important. Ça, c'était après les noyaux durs et tout ça, des privatisations. Voilà. Alors, méthodologie, c'est un peu ça. Ouais.
Jeanne, on va être presque à la fin. Je voudrais terminer par une question sur votre optimisme à la fin. En disant finalement, avec EU Next Generation, on passe à une nouvelle étape. Il y a une nouvelle ère qui s'ouvre parce qu'on arrive à faire sauter le tabou de la dette. Mais en même temps, il y a un point commun entre EU Next Generation et ce qui s'est fait au moment de la crise de l'Eurozone. C'est un très fort pilotage par le haut des institutions et qui est un pilotage qui peut être extrêmement aveugle et sourd. On a vu les débats en Italie autour de la possible utilisation des fonds de Next Generation et ça a quand même conduit un gouvernement à exploser. On voit les débats aujourd'hui en Grèce sur le plan Greece 2.0 qui contient des investissements pratiquement exclusivement dans les secteurs contrôlés par les étrangers, notamment les Allemands. Et donc, on a quand même quelque chose ici d'inquiétant qui est, au fur et à mesure des crises, on a un renforcement d'un pouvoir très centralisé, mais en même temps très sourd aux réalités de terrain. Et donc, une forme de fédéralisme inquiétant dans le développement de l'Union.
Vous avez tout à fait raison, je suis d'accord. Pour moi, l'optimisme, c'est peut-être parce que je suis américaine, que moi, je trouve, avec tout ce qu'il y a eu, qui était affreux, finalement, il y a un moment de possibilité, avec au moins ces investissements, et on n'est plus dans les règles de déficit et de dette tout le temps. Maintenant, au moins, il y a de l'investissement. Mais vous avez absolument raison que le problème, c'est que c'est toujours un peu hiérarchique. Mais il y a les National Recovery and Resilience Plans qui sont censés venir du bas en haut. Mais il y a aussi les réformes structurelles toujours demandées. Mais ils sont des meilleures réformes structurelles. Ce n'est pas qu'on demande maintenant de couper les fonds pour l'État-providence. C'est plus ça. On ne demande plus de se débarrasser des syndicats. Au moins ça. Mais il y a toujours des problèmes. Avec ça, je suis tout à fait d'accord et c'est pour ça que on m'avait demandé de faire des propositions de réforme et là j'en ai à la fin, c'est décentraliser et démocratiser le semestre européen. Ça doit vraiment être du bas en haut parce que c'est toujours maintenant, c'est vrai, c'est trop. Alors on accepte que pour le moment, c'est ce que c'est, mais que et là c'est très centralisé au niveau national. Il faudrait que ça se décentralise non seulement de l'Union européenne jusqu'au niveau national, mais aussi au niveau local, aussi bien que régional. Très important. Parce que le problème, c'est que c'est seulement les gens du terrain qui comprennent, qui savent bien ce dans lequel il faudrait investir. C'est toujours un problème, mais c'est le début. C'est le début. Et en parlant avec les gens de la commission, ils ont dit qu'ils ont l'intention de décentraliser plus. Ils ne m'ont pas répondu sur la démocratisation. Mais là, c'est là où il faut avoir la société civile dedans. C'est pour ça que j'ai dit que les Competitiveness Councils devraient devenir des Industrial Policy Councils. Et en fait, je pense que c'est dans le livre, je parle de repenser, si on pense au plan français des années 50, pourquoi est-ce que ça marchait? C'était pas parce que le haut disait qu'il faut faire ça, c'est parce que c'était on demandait aux forces vives, comme disait de Gaulle, aux forces vives de la société de parler, de s'entreparler. Et il y avait un plan, mais ce n'était pas le plan qui était important, c'est que les gens se parlaient et pensaient au futur. Et il y avait de l'argent pour l'investissement dans des domaines importants. C'est ça qui est important. Et c'était vraiment au niveau régional qu'on faisait ça. C'est ça qu'il faut en Europe. Mais ça veut dire que, mais il faut une révolution des idées. Il faut se débarrasser des idées non seulement ordolibéraux, si on parle de la BCE, mais aussi des idées néolibérales qui sont l'État est mauvais et le marché est toujours très bon. Non, il ne faut pas faire ça. Il faut avoir un État entrepreneurial. Et pour ça, mais alors là, ça revient à des choses que j'ai écrites sur l'économie politique et les variétés du capitalisme, le fait que la France et les pays du sud de l'Europe sont beaucoup plus state-enhanced capitalism, c'est-à-dire c'est l'État qui a toujours pris le devant et on a besoin de ça toujours. Et le néolibéralisme et les réformes qui sont venues d'en haut, spécialement de l'Europe, ont fait que l'État ne faisait pas ce dont on avait besoin dans les pays du sud de l'Europe et de la France. Parce que les marchés dans ces pays ne marchent pas comme ils marchent dans les pays anglo-saxons, c'est sûr, aussi bien que dans les pays du Nord. Ils sont des modèles différents du capitalisme qui marchent autrement. Et priver la France de l'État, mais c'est pas possible. Pas possible. L'État, c'est tout, non? L'État républicain, naturellement. Mais très important. Et c'est toujours le réflexe français qui est très bon, c'est de dire, voilà, il faut revenir avec un État qui sait bien faire. Et ça revient que maintenant. Peut-être c'est un peu trop centralisé, ça c'est autre chose. Alors, mon optimisme, c'est au moins les choses commencent à changer, mais il y a un grand travail à faire pour repenser les idées de l'économie en Europe et partout, en fait, dans le monde, revenir sur le néolibéralisme avec quelque chose de nouveau, quelque chose de sur l'écologie, sustainable growth, très important pour un vrai tournant. Et je suis optimiste parce que je n'ai pas envie d'être pessimiste. Je prie que les choses vont changer. Mais on commence, on est sur le chemin. Et pour ça, comme Muriel a dit, on a besoin de plus de leadership. Du vrai leadership, mais aussi des citoyens qui poussent. Et ça existe. Et les jeunes générations, ils sont beaucoup plus écolos que les autres. Je pense qu'il y a des possibilités là.
Bon, on va clore et on va vous remercier sur cette note d'optimisme qui est rare, qui va nous faire du bien, surtout dans cette période un peu compliquée. Mille merci, Vivien. Cet exercice était lourd, long, mais mille merci. Mille merci.